Welcome back to the Scrivenery, everyone. My name is Trevor Stamper, and I'm from Blind Visionary Publications. And today I have my co-hosts, Nick Barron from Breaker Press Games,
Yep.
and Ed Stanek from Gregorian. Is that, how do we say
Rayorgan Games.
Games.
I will always regret not picking something more intuitive to pronounce.
No, it's okay. Anyway, tonight we're here to talk to you about maps. Maps and map making. For those of you who are, considering your first, third-party publishing zine and everything, making the maps can seem like a daunting task. And there are many ways you can go with that. You can always hire somebody, but tonight we're going to talk about making your own maps and the ways you can do that. I think the first question to tackle is, when you're working on your zine, why is your map important? What does your map need to do for you? It, like any other piece of art in your book, it's a piece of visual illustration, right? It's a piece of visual storytelling. And so the map, or maps, because you may have multiples, have to give a specific pieces of information. And that's really good to maybe take a moment and bullet point that out, because anything else in your map is really, superfluous, right? You just need to know, I got to do these things. And if you hit those points, you're good to go. Maps can give, visual sense of what is going on much faster sometimes than a paragraph, right? So they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, a map is worth 1,000 words. We're going to talk about why that is today on tonight's show. So once we've recognized the purpose of our map and we're going to let it drive us, there's a couple of different ways we can map. And for that, I'm going to hand it over to Nick. Nick, why don't we talk about what are the different ways, the different kinds of maps? What could we have?
So to help me illustrate, I've got my copy of the World Builder's Handbook, because I don't have all of these types of maps drawn. But the one thing that's cool about this book, and this book is made by Jacob Hurst from Swordfish Islands, is that at the back of this cool journal are samples of all different types of maps. I think they were all done by Dyson Logos. Essentially, like you've got your typical underground lair, and so this is like a cavern-esque lair versus your typical thing like that. But these types of maps are actually fairly easy to draw all on your own. There are also the single building. Their example of this, I don't know who would have a tavern this large. That's a really big tavern. But that was one of the samples that they included, and it's handy. It gives you ideas of how, like, when you're looking at a map like this, you've got your tables, you've got different chairs and things like that, and you can see that this gives you a lot of information in a small space. And that is part of why maps are so important, because they give you a sense of space and context. And so, like, for example, when you are looking at, let's say, box text, and you are reading out loud the box text, people be like, well, what does that look like again? And then boom, you bust out your single building map and are able to break that all down. Then there is the wilderness location, and I do have some of these that I've drawn myself. So this right here is the town of Stennard, and I've got all sorts. I've got a fire pit, and I've got all sorts of trees and things like that, a stream. And we're going to talk about Paths Peculiar later in the show, but I learned how to draw maps to this quality because of that. And then what was that?
Me too.
Exactly. And so then you've also got your hex maps for doing like full-on wilderness. And so and this book, the reason why I pulled this book out is because even though I have maps spread out across all sorts of things, this thing is fantastic because it has pages of hex maps. It has pages of of bullet journal style, and it even has I have I have not done well with this. Oh yeah. But there is sections for doing what are called isometric maps, which have a completely different pattern for the graph paper. But let me big is when I need it in a hurry. Oh, there it is. But here was my first attempt at an isometric map. And as you can see, the pattern of the graph paper is very different than your typical dots or squares or hexes. And so yeah, you've got a lot of different types of maps, and they convey a lot of very important information. So yeah.
So Nick, I think what you're talking about there are a lot of narrow focus maps, right? So what Nick has just explained is we've got maps that are like of a specific building or of a specific village. I believe that's just the center of Stennard, right? There's actually more to Stennard than that.
That is correct.
What Nick is doing is he's narrowing in on a focused area. There's also broad focus maps, and he's showing you some of those, so you've got some there. These are campaign world things, like so physical features. You may have maps of ethnic groups, trade routes, magical levels, right? So magical null zones or areas where the magic spikes and stuff like this. Some great examples of that can be found in old versions of of the RuneQuest, right? And so the old RuneQuest books done by Greg Stafford and everything, especially his big encyclopedia that it has 2 broad sections, really go into detail, and we'll talk about trade routes and things like this and where you can find resources, and those things create a lot of background and stuff. So those are kind of, big 40,000 foot viewpoint maps and everything. And those can take a lot of different shapes too. Let me give you an example. This is from the recently released Lord of Maps. This is you can find this at Lord of Maps. I think it's lordofmaps.com. And we've got a link we can put a link in the show notes for you. This was a Kickstarter that recently ended, and this gentleman actually has done almost he's done every state in the United States. So for instance, here's what Virginia looks like done to kind of a Tolkien-esque type mapping style. And the great thing about this is these are broad overland maps, but the last 20 or 30 pages is a how-to. What are the tools necessary in order to build your maps and stuff? And they're very simple tools if you're going to do your own art. We will get to talking about digital art tonight as well. But you really need some pencils. You need if you're going to do isometric, a specific type of graph paper, isometric graph paper. You need some good board. I use usually what they call Strathmore 300, right, which is just a nice Bristol board. It's has a low texture to it. It's able to take a pencil and pens, permanent markers like microns or Copic markers really well. And so those allow you to get those broad features in. Another good way to find that would be something like this book, How to Draw Fantasy Art and RPG Maps. This is by Jared Blando, who is almost always at Gen Con. So if you ever go to Gen Con in the art section, Jared has his maps for sale. Some of them sell for literally thousands of dollars. They're incredibly detailed. But here he takes you step by step through, for instance, how do you draw Tolkien-esque type trees and stuff. And it starts with something as simple as a shape. And from there, you begin to layer in different, tree shapes, right? So this is a great practice book. And so beyond the Dyson website, which we can also link in our show notes, this book right here by Blando has been a really great thing. And I'll often open it up and work on it and just do examples of maps and everything. And you can just practice on things. Like, for instance, this is a little watercolor pad that I've done. And here you can see some elevation or scale kind of trees and just getting the shadow in right. And I've got little notes on the different colors of watercolor that I've used. And then I also used a Copic marker to outline them, which really pops them. And so those types of things are all tools you can do and things to build kind of broad focused campaign worlds. So maps convey information. Like we said, pictures worth 1,000 words. Ed, what kind of information can they convey?
It's interesting. I was talking recently with someone on a Facebook conversation about the Silmarillion. And so I mentioned to this one person, yeah, I read it, and I didn't, there was that show on Amazon Prime that, well, okay. I said, or he said, I'm really impressed that you made it through the whole book. And I said, yeah, it was kind of a tough read, but I bought this guidebook that really helped a lot. And there are two things the guidebook had. One was family trees, because all the names in all the names of the elves are about the same. But then it also had a bunch of maps where it would show almost like a Cliff Notes thing. All right, here's what's happening at this point. Here's what's happening at that point. And having those maps added a great deal to my understanding of a book that is, can be a real challenge to piece together everything that's going on. So I think it's important when you're talking about the information, or the information that you want to get across with the map. The first question I think that you want to answer is, who is this map for? Because it's a map that's meant for the GM is going to have a different character than a map that's meant for players. And you will see oftentimes, even I remember going back to I think the Isle of Dread, if I remember correctly, where they had a map that was the GM's map where everything was, and then there was a player's map that you would tear out that was just the coastline, and you would have to chart yourself where as you were exploring. And maps that are meant for GMs tend to be strictly information tools in terms of just the facts, because they want to, the GM is using it as a reference, and so that's what they want to get across. Maps that are meant for players, on the other hand, oftentimes are looking to convey part of the information is an emotional information. They want to get across a certain mood. They want to get across a certain sense of feel. And I've got an example map that I want to bring up for this. Elena, if you could show Raven's graphic. So this was a map that my wife did for a module that she's working on. And the way you get the feel just by looking at it that it's a rundown, ruined kind of building, and the map immediately conveys that. It gives you that atmosphere. So maps for players often have atmosphere, and if you harken back to the stereotypical "there be dragons here," and things that are on the edge of the map that, in a certain sense, it's information, but it's just as much conveying a vague concept. And so a lot of times your map that's meant for your players is going to it might be short on specifics, but you want it to give you want it to have a feel to it that when they're looking at that, is going to inspire the same kind of thing that you would want someone in that setting, that feeling to have, either because it's going to give them a sense of verisimilitude that, oh, I feel like I can relate because this feels period authentic, or if it's a map of oh, here's the dangerous orc lands over here, and so you have the skull and crossbones and various other things that are meant to convey death, and okay, this feels dangerous, and so those things are an important part of what is the map for the player. It's not just data information, it's emotional information. And so that can really drive the map for the GM, especially. It's going to be a lot of names. For example, here's where this capital is, here's where this trade route is, et cetera, including, here's where this dungeon is, things that the players aren't going to have. Maps for the players will often have, I don't remember if I said GM or players. I meant to say GMs on the last one. Anyway, maps for the player. Okay, maps for the players, especially will tend to have things that invite adventure, drive adventure. Especially on a big old campaign map, there's this area over here. Maybe you've got some kind of vague zone. Your map loses detail as it goes over there because as far as the information the players have, our knowledge of this is kind of fuzzy. and so there's very little detail in that area. But then there's maybe then again, like the Arabian Dragons here or whatever. This is the giant lands, or the tower of the Archmage is over here or whatever. And you as a or rather, you as a writer or the GM may not have any concept of what that's going to be at the onset when the map is created. When the GM is starting a campaign, you don't have every necessarily thing planned out, but those things invite adventure and invite the expansion, especially if you're doing a sandbox kind of game. They invite the players to go in different places, and that sparks player imagination, and that's a very powerful thing about having a map help tell a story.
Hey Ed, I got a question for you.
Sure.
Do you ever lie on your player maps? Yeah, Nick.
Rarely, but that's a really great point, because you want to convey. Yeah, absolutely. The players often are going to have a map that's based on misconceptions. Yeah, that's a great storytelling technique.
Or intentional lies, right? You've got a treasure map, and there's an X on the map, but it's not the one that marks the actual spot, right?
It marks the mimic.
Right. It marks the mimic. Or you got to also think about the story about where the map came from, who created this map, who sold this map, what was their goal in getting this map into the player's hands. It's one thing for players to find a map as part of treasure and they don't know any backstory to it. It's an entirely different thing for a mysterious person to show up in the street and sell them the map for a couple of gold pieces or something in the night. And I often I almost always lie somewhere on a player map.
Also you gotta think in like what has changed in the last 50 years since the map was originally drawn. But yeah, a good player map in certain contexts needs to be an unreliable narrator, because that is, you don't want to show secret doors. You don't want to necessarily show, a whole variety of things that should be surprises. So
yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I like is actually giving maps to players at the beginning of an adventure, intentionally setting it up so that they have that in their mindset. That's what that place looks like, and then altering those details or hiding things in those details they didn't realize they were looking at it the whole time, and they just maybe they were looking at it upside down, or maybe the guy that drew it was drunk. Those things happen. So
or was an evil cultist and wanted you to go to.
They're intentionally trying to get you in there so they can get you in that summoning circle and finish the ritual.
Exactly.
So those are all great uses for player maps, and so player maps have a completely different objective than a map for the judge, and I think that's useful to think about.
Well, and one thing I think that's a good example of that too. When a lot of times maps of a dungeon, for example, or inside of a building are done with great precision as though it's like an architectural drawing. And for GM, that's fine. A map for a player, whether this is actually even is just as much if it's if it's a geographical map, because if you look at 300-year-old maps that show what they thought America looked like or what Africa looked like, it's maybe has hints of reality, but one way in which this comes into play is when you've got secret rooms, hidden rooms inside a building, you don't want the map to automatically give away, hey, there's a big old dead space in the middle. I bet there's a secret room there. If your rooms are approximations because it's something that again, someone sketched without having a surveyor's tools, then yeah, they're not going to be ultimately precise, and so that way that makes it easier to hide things.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
All right, so let's talk about different views that can be. Sure.
I've got one last thing I want to share. So this is a little map that I drew. It's in actually For Whom the Bell Trolls, Smoking Worm Monograph 1. And there's a whole bunch of little notes on this map that are not in the text. They're specifically not in the text because they're meant for emergent play, because there's always possibilities that players could pursue that aren't necessarily something I'm going to build out, right? And so I often leave those types of things, especially in judge maps. Those are actually little notes are difficulty numbers to squeeze through narrow passages. I don't talk about them. I don't give any further information, but sometimes it's useful to just leave information on maps, right? And not talk about it because, and actually sometimes it's really useful for judges to put the information they need on the map because that's what they see the most when they're running through an adventure or something. And so putting difficulties for traps and stuff right on the map is a great way to speed play. Making notes. I mean, obviously that map is then not intended for the players, but that's okay. So the map, remember, is a visual. It's a visual design element, and it is meant to be used to speed stuff up and to give accurate information to the judge, who then may not, reliably narrate it to the players. But yeah, sorry, Ed. I just wanted to make sure we got that point in there that, there's lots of ways to actually use maps to enhance the ability to move through adventures quickly.
Absolutely. One other thing I wanted to throw out that I just remembered. When we talk about the map driving new aspects to adventure, I came across a quote from Tolkien, who said, quote, "I wisely started with a map." And basically what he said was, first I drew the map and then I let that drive the story. Now, I'm not saying that any writer has to take that approach, but certainly from an RPG standpoint, again, if you've got things on there that can, especially in a sandbox kind of game, that can lead to other adventures that aren't yet spelled out, those are great tools for GMs to have.
Absolutely.
Yep. So one of the things that you mentioned was the idea of a map inviting adventure. And before I get into the different views, one of the things that I find really interesting when I am working on a project, generally, like when I started with the Precipice of Corruption, I started really small. I drew a dungeon map, and then after I had a dungeon, I'm like, I need a town that the people that are going into the dungeon are coming from. And so those were the two things that I started with. That was where everything began. But what's interesting with what Ed said about creating the opening to explore. So in the last couple of years, I drew this map, the Domains of House Genulane, which is the whole region around Stennard. And one of the things that you need that goes back to what Trevor was just saying a second ago, I have all of these notes over here as to what places are called. And I have things on here like the Swallowing Fens. I have no idea what defines the Swallowing Fens.
But it sounds darn cool.
It was a cool sounding name. I jotted it on the thing, and I do know that there are some fens down here, so those must be the Swallowing Fens. But the other thing that I was going to say about this is that so there's a bunch of little X's on here that indicate where different adventure locations are that I have written or intend to write. And so I showed this to one of my groups, and they're really into maps. And so immediately they're like, we want to go where that X is. Because I don't even have that X written, but they're like, I want to go where that X is. But that's part of the joy of maps is being able to expand. I basically started real small and got to the point where now I've expanded out, and I don't have all of this fleshed out, and it's not that important that I do. But this can be an example of a topographic map. It shows all of the different types of features. We've got your hills and your mountains and it shows the topography of the land along with rivers and lakes and even fens. But one of the things that I marked in here, actually, this map actually shows different gradations of elevation, starting with the middle being the lowest spot, and then there are defined lines. It's not necessarily as clear as, let's say, the Keep on the Borderlands, but it looks cooler because those little faint circles in the Keep on the Borderlands if you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up. But that there was a certain way that they depicted elevation in the old maps that is different than how it generally gets depicted now. And then schematic. Oh, do I have a sample of schematic? I think there actually might be one in here. I feel like there might have been a spaceship layout in here. But yeah, a schematic is essentially a thing that gives you a breakdown of what a piece of machinery or what have you, in the case of like a spaceship, gives a defined layout of what it looks like.
No,
Trevor.
you're absolutely right. So a schematic can represent that, but it can also represent an abstraction of a map. So when you're dealing with underground dungeon delving, right, you may know where point A is, and you may know where point B is, and you may know that there are things in between it, but you don't know what the distance is. And so sometimes you can draw schematics. And so as a matter of fact, a really good example of schematic maps, and the reason why I put it in our show notes, guys, and I should have made it clear, is Tales from the Smoking Worm 6 has an entire schematic depiction language built into it for tentacular nests, because you're building them in schematic form in order to map everything efficiently. And so, I mean, you can have hundreds of little like dungeon, little cave systems and everything, but that gets hard to map. And when you're trying to do it in a small amount of space, the schematic can actually represent things sometimes much more visually easily for the judge. And you don't need to convey that to the players, because you'll have a distance on there. You'll know it's 2,000 or 3,000 feet to the next, branch, or the next, up or down shaft or something like that. That's not relevant. The actual map doesn't have to convey physical space. It can be built as a schematic, like an electrical grid diagram. So yeah. Or you can show schematics that show machinery and stuff. Same type of idea, but they do different things. So
one thing that it's not a map in a traditional sense, but one of the things that's popular in games like Mothership is the idea of just having a series of squares and how they interconnect to each other.
That's a schematic.
Yeah. It just gives you a very, very abstract view of how things connect.
But I think the important point here is, for the third-party publisher, if your map is really only intended for the judge, a schematic map can sometimes better represent the data and the information you're trying to get across in a quick, small space without needing to hire an artist. And almost anybody can draw boxes on a grid and connect them with lines. And I don't actually have, I didn't pull an example of that, but unfortunately I have stacks of maps here in case we needed them. But it is something that I've been working on quite a bit, because I've been working on this tentacular article, and there is an entire language for how to do it, and it's inspired by a couple of other pieces of work. Is it Patrick Stewart? Or Patrick Stewart's he did the Lamentations of the Flame Princess, did a really big book on Underdark adventures. It's got a guy falling on a red cover. I have one copy of it. You're going to have a hard time finding it. Something of the Earth. I can't remember what it is now, but the book now sells for like $600 because it's out of print. But if you can find it, you should buy it. That's all I can tell you, because it is a phenomenal idea on how to map schematically. And I've abstracted it and simplified it for these tentacular maps. But it really is a great way for a third-party publisher to get something across quickly, easily, and succinctly, without having to draw something complicated.
Is it Veins of the Earth?
Veins of the Earth, actually. Thank you so much. That's one of the few reference books I've ever bought that I actually read cover to cover multiple times, because it's just fascinating. And the license ended at Lamentations, and it hasn't been reprinted, which is why it's out of print right now. But if you can ever get a copy of it, I think you can get it digitally still. But the hardback is beefy, it's small, and the paper is like cardstock in and of itself. It's a massive thing, and it's a really great, interesting read on claustrophobic dungeon delving. So yeah.
And one of the other 2D types of maps that isn't actually listed here is the vertical map. There
No, it's an elevation map. Instead of topographic elevation, which is the side view of a vertical series.
So this is from How to Draw, or excuse me, How to Write Adventures That Don't Suck by Goodman Games. But this map came to mind. It is an under the sea map that shows a variety of different caverns, but in a vertical sense. And I actually used this device in my upcoming thing, Cleft in the Mangled Hills, because I struggled to try and represent this tower that essentially goes underground. So yeah, it's a very, very handy way to do things. Yeah, when you said elevation, I thought more like the tiers of like the Caves of Chaos in
No, so in yeah, you're absolutely right there. But an elevation view is a side view of any type of feature, right? And that feature could be the wall of a room, right? If you're building a house, I know this because I built a house. I had to draw the elevations of each room so people could understand where the windows went and stuff. But the other thing is that elevation can be expanded to a broad scale, like you just showed, and you can see hundreds or thousands of feet deep. Again, Patrick Stewart did something called Deep Carbon Observatory, which is the main map is an elevation map. It's a slice through the earth, showing the Deep Carbon Observatory, and I believe it's also an isometric form. So many isometric maps are elevation maps tilted at 30 degrees, so you can see all the features. And the classic example of that would be Ravenloft, which is the first isometric map done in role-playing games, I believe.
And if people are wondering, once again, that is what an isometric map looks like.
Yeah, and allows you to see detail in kind of 3 dimensions. And it can be very evocative, but it can also be very frustrating. If it's not a simple layout, it takes real skill to produce that. But it is possible. And the great thing is that they make big tablets, 11 by 17 size tablets of isometric paper. I use it with a fairly cheap light box. Oh, look, actually, I have a map on the light box. So what I do, this is a light box. It just hooks in and then it powers up. I don't have it plugged in right now. And in this case, I'm doing elevations just like Nick was saying. And what I do is I actually go, I knew where I wanted to draw. I go to Google Earth or Earth, put it on not on satellite mode, but on the visual representation of landmass modes. And then I find the place that looks really evocative, take a screenshot, print it, and then I draw over it. So for instance, this has lots of hills. This original landscape was incredibly flat. But I use that because it's the easiest way to get truly realistic looking shores, edges of land masses, because they're real. And because you're basically taking a screenshot, drawing around it and maybe changing it and everything. I do that quite a bit. For instance, this is a good example of the map from For Whom the Bell Trolls. And so this is actually a Norwegian ford that I took and loosely then this is the rough sketch.
So I just gotta say, pulling out your light box must have been the nerdiest thing we've ever done on this show.
What can I say? It was awesome. But here is the light box version that's cleaned up.
Yeah.
And then I actually, because For Whom the Bell Trolls is done in 2 colors and the elevation lines are in blue, they're actually done here in black, scanned separately, converted to blue, then overlaid in Photoshop. And that's a huge amount of work that you don't have to do, but it got the look that I wanted. So, and you know what? I've like never drawn maps in a serious fashion. It just takes a little bit of thought and you can get there without a problem. Another good example, if we got a second, is here. I needed this little detail in high resolution. And so I literally photocopied that up big and then again, light boxed it to get the marketplace map that I wanted. hated the background texture. That I did all this dithering in there, and so I reproduced that, cleaned it up in Photoshop, and overlaid it again, and that gave a much better look. And so you can do things in analog, and it doesn't take a lot of effort. That was actually fairly cheap. So if you need a large scanner, again, we've talked about it before, Ed, but most libraries have a scanner. And so, like, for instance, we're in Cincinnati, Ed and I are. Cincinnati Public Library has an 18 by 24 high resolution, high quality color scanner, and they're free. So you can go sit there for an hour if you need and scan whatever you want in whatever resolution you want, and everything at no charge. And most cities have a library that has similar features. What you're looking for is something called a makerspace.
Yeah.
And that's really, really helpful. Sorry, I hijacked that moment, but it was
okay.
like a perfect moment to show an elevation map and everything.
You got excited. And,
That's
and it
right.
makes sense.
It happens.
And one of the things that I think is important to note, and we're going to get into all of the different types of techniques and what have you, but it is important to note that there are different levels of equipment and what have you. Trevor has a light box and utilizes all these things. I literally just draw in this thing and in some day planners. And if instead of trying to use a light box to like work out, not have certain textures or what have you that you need to scan out, I literally just go through with Photoshop and tweak things until I can easily erase all of the dots. And
you're absolutely right. So as a matter of fact, I designed this space. This is my primary drawing space that I do our shows in, and I actually have a lighting system and everything here so that I can turn on the light, turn off the light, and focus on the ground and stuff.
Yeah.
And then the light box can sit here and I can work. And that's a workspace designed from my 10th grade graphic design class where everything was done by hand.
Mm-hmm.
So that would have been in the mid 80s, right? And that's how I learned to do things. And so, I mean, these light boxes, this is a big one. You don't need one this big, I guarantee you. And if you get them like 11 by 14 or something, they're like $30 on Amazon, and they'll last you years. Yeah. They don't take up much space. Mine sits between the wall and oops, my map just came off.
Oh no!
Between the wall and a filing cabinet where I keep all my pens and markers in and stuff. And so those are things you can do. This will give you that classic feel because all of the maps from TSR kind of early first edition, I guarantee you they were hand drawn, yeah. Right? And as a matter of fact, I mean, so Diesel and many of those original artists and everything learned cartography on the fly and had to invent a lot of the things that we take for granted now. So I showed you some examples of hand designed layers. You can do color versus black and white, and that's easy too. So for instance, this is a really nice just map showing an establishment. Basically, it is the guild house for something that we call the School of the Tree. But if you look at it in the actual publication, right, I've gone in and colorized it to help make it pop. And the reason and this is simply a Photoshop layer, and then I use InDesign for my program, and then all the words are overlaid in InDesign on a different layer. And so those are simple techniques that you can use. You can create layers, like I said, without needing to do it digitally. You can do it by hand and scan them in and then layer them in. There's other different types of coloring you can do in black and white. As I showed you, here's the map, the central map for Whom the Bell Trolls, and you can see here that I've gone in and you digitally turned it in color. You can see the elevation lines are in blue and stuff like this. Those were originally all black, and all we did was change the printer instructions. Hey, these lines need to be blue, and everything, and then that they printed them in blue. You can do color quite easily and quite cheaply this required about $10 worth of watercolor and a brush and a marker. So it doesn't take much to go, and they go a long way. You don't even need to do that. This is my campaign map that my players put together. For those of you who are Goodman Games fans, that is Hero from Doom of the Savage Kings, and over time, natives, villagers died out, or my players bought houses and they color coded who lived in what house and everything, so they could keep track of things. They also went out and color coded the different vegetable patches they grew, because many of them had vegetable farms around the city. As the players matured, they bought land, they hired workers, and they literally then started. And the last time we played this was a while back, but they were asking me to actually expand the map, basically redraw it on my light box, so they could change. They had wiped out a couple buildings and rebuilt buildings and stuff, and they wanted to upgrade the map and get the fields all organized as to what actual vegetables they were growing in what fields, because that's what the players wanted to know, right? And they wanted to track that. Why they wanted to track it, I don't know. They wanted to know how many cabbages they were going to have through the winter and stuff, which is a really strange thing for players to want to know. But who am I to limit their imagination? But that's a published Goodman Games map. I cleaned a couple things off of it just because they didn't need to see them. And one of the great things Goodman Games has been doing in their virtual token series is reproducing their maps in color, but also reproducing them for players to see without the notes that judges need. And so that's really nice as well. So that's an example of pencils. You can literally do crayon, watercolor, markers. Do I have them? My Copic markers are down here, but you can buy Copic markers at any fine art store, or there are plenty of other types of markers. Literally, just go get a Crayola set of 128 markers, and you're good to go. And you can do these things. What types of pens do you use, Nick? I use microns, and then
I use microns,
and then I use Copic multiliners. Microns are disposable. They're beautiful in color. They come in multiple colors. There's a red, brown, green, blue, so you can do nice colored features right on one map. As a matter of fact, the Lord of Maps uses microns. Like Frank Cho, the comic book artist, uses microns. I use these Copic markers. They're called multiliners. They're refillable. So once you buy a set, you basically can just buy the black ink, or if you want to, you can get other types of ink and change it out. The other thing you can do is pen and nib. And so this is just a calligraphy set. The pencils cost a couple dollars. The nibs cost $1 or $2. And then I just go and get different types of calligraphy inks or comic book inks, India inks, and things like that. And they cost a couple of dollars, but they last a long time. Nick?
Since we're getting tight on time, I figured I would mention now, since you were showing the micron pens, when you go to sites that explain to you how to draw maps, like Paths Peculiar, their tutorials actually tell you, all right, for this use a 005, for this use a 01, for this use a 05, or excuse me, 05 or a 08. And so it will tell you, the site will give you instructions. These are the sizes that you want to use in order to do this stuff, so that you're not walking into the art store and be like, I don't know what to buy. Because if we just say, go get some micron pens, you're going to go through a lot of trial and error.
There are, and one of the things you should do is get a scratch piece of paper and then try, pushing hard and then pushing light, because you can get different line weights out of the same pen. It depends on how you use it. And so this is a good example. You can get in here and see the fine detail. These are done with, 0.3s or 0.1s, versus the hard heavy lines here are done with a 0.5.
Though so if you press hard with a 005,
it'll go through the
paper.
Look
Look like this.
Yeah. There is some limit to what you can do with these. So, starting out simple is great, but we can get way more, cool with this, right? We can get into the digital age, and so there's some cool things. Nick, what else have we got to go?
So I got assigned in this list. I should have adjusted it before. I've never messed with Procreate. I know that it is a thing that is used on tablets, and that artists use it, but I have never messed with it at all. But the one thing that this is going to overlap with stuff that Ed's going to talk about, is there is, if you want to do classic dungeon map style, like black and white classic dungeon map style, and just drag and drop shapes, there is a website that we'll put in the things called Dungeon Scrawl, and it literally allows you to do dice and logos style maps, just by pushing stuff around. So I am actually also going to put that in the comments as well, for anybody that wants to go take a look at that. But if you've got anything that you wanted to say about Procreate,
Sure, I've used it on Apple products, so on iPads, it's great. It's about a $5-10 product now. It has a huge amount of robusticity to it. Some examples of those, I've seen elevation maps done that way. I've seen traditional city maps done, and even dungeon maps and everything. There are several different illustrators who use Procreate exclusively now, because with your iPad, you can in your $10 purchase, you can get all the different line weights of inks and everything that you want, and you can create layers. And most of the stuff that Ed's going to talk about in digital tools, you can do in Procreate. It's just a different app on a different platform. And so why don't I hand it over to Ed, and he can talk about digital tools, because that's his specialty, is digital tooling and stuff.
Yeah, I don't really have an artistic bone in my body in terms of visual arts. So I have leaned heavily on mapping tools. Specifically, my tool of choice is called Campaign Cartographer, put out by Pro Fantasy, and they have a line of products that are, there's the main product, which is Campaign Cartographer, which is meant for outdoor landmass maps. They've got Dungeon Designer, which is for your dungeon. They've got City Designer, city maps. They've got various things that you can add on to it that and that expand it. And what really the big benefits that I see for me is for those who aren't artistically inclined, it makes it easy to create something, because it's got tools, it's got prefab things that you can drop into place. It's got layers, and so I can have a layer of stuff that's just for GMs. I can have a layer of stuff that reflects different kinds of information. Real quick, Elena, graphic CC1. So this is one of my broader geographic maps from one of my books. And then on that map, I have turned off the cities, because at that scale, it would just be, it'd be, you wouldn't be able to really see them. Okay, go to CC2. So here on one of the sections in the book that we're in, I zoom in on one of the particular countries. Okay, now all I got to do is turn on the layer that shows cities and export that graphic, and I don't have to create a whole new map. And then that added for that one particular country, here's the more detail. And then CC3, when I expanded and came out with an underwater expansion for the game world, I didn't have to make a new map. All I had to do was take that same map, and add layers that were water depths. So the ability to have layers that convey different information for different contexts, including that are meant for different scales of projection, that's very handy. You can save it and make changes, and if you have an oops, it's real easy to go back to a previous copy. There's also a tool which I haven't used, but I've seen, called Virtual Battle Map, which is meant kind of for things that are like, if you want to do maps for your tabletop game, you have your miniatures on, for example. There's also a product called World Anvil, which is does a lot of things. It's meant for a GM to organize everything of their campaign. Here's the notes, here's the family trees, here's maps, and they have mapping tools that are built into that. And those maps can be hot linked. So you have a city on the map, and you click on that, and it brings up information about the city, I guess. So yeah, there's a lot that you could go into in terms of the capabilities of these products, but some of them have like demo versions that you can get. But so for those of us who don't feel real comfortable trying to draw your own, some of these are great tools. I also pasted a few minutes ago a link to a site called D-Maps, which has digital maps of basically every location in the world. And so, as Trevor was talking about, if you want a realistic map, taking something that starting from something that is a real world location, you can't beat that. So that's for those of us who are not real artistic, I feel like that's a good alternative. And also then it has certain capabilities vis-a-vis the layers and zooming in, zooming out to create different different portions of the map that can be real handy. So what's that?
Sorry, Ed, I didn't mean to cut you off there. There's another app, I think it was free, called Old Maps, and I have it on my iPhone, and it is literally a digital repository for old maps, like 17th century
period
maps.
accurate.
Period accurate map. These are real maps from certain periods. For instance, I'm looking at playing Weird Frontiers, a local game here, with some of my friends, and I want to base it out of San Francisco. And they literally have like maps of Alcatraz and San Francisco from like, here's 1815, here's 1848, here's 1872, here's 1898.
The actual map from that time frame.
And these are actual maps from those time frames, right, including early survey maps done by the city and stuff like this. So so they go all the way back into antiquity. And you just plug in your name, place name, and say, I want to look at Greece. And it pops up all the maps about Greece or London or something like this. Tim Satley has been commenting in the chat. Hey, Tim, he's running Badass Bunnies. I don't remember. I backed it, so I don't remember when it ends. 2 days?
2 hours. Ends in
2
2
hours. So, guys, 2 hours. But Tim was telling us that he uses Incarnate, which originally started as a character tracking map, someone else pointed out. So thanks for the comments and stuff, guys. Tim, best of luck on Badass Bunnies.
Yes.
We got about a minute to go through some of these other resources. I'm going to be dropping links into the chat as people are talking about them. There's a great YouTube channel called Map Crow where this guy talks about both the theory and practice of various map making.
Right. And then there's Paths Peculiar, which both Nick and I have mentioned, which is a wonderful tutorial on how to get you started on very simple dungeon mapping using a pencil, a couple of pens, and one shade marker, right? Usually a shade of gray, like a 10% or a 20% gray. And that's
Sleepy
all you
Fingers
really need.
Just mentioned also JP Covert, and JP Covert just he's done a bunch of videos on YouTube on how to make maps, and also has released a couple of zines.
That's right. And so we also have the Jared Blando book. I have the how to draw fantasy map, RPGA maps, but I noticed I was on Amazon just the other day, and he has a follow-up to this, which by the way was a bestseller and is really cheap. It's like $20. And his follow-up is called Fantasy Map Maker: How to Draw Fantasy Towns. And so it is again step-by-step instructions on how to come from a shape to a finished whatever, right? Building with roof and everything and stuff like this. And so, there's were there any others? Any other things that we want to get out there? There are so many tools to get you started.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's it. This is the end of the episode. I'd like to thank you all for watching.
Yes.
Ed and I would like to thank Nick. Nick's gonna step away from the mic for a while and pursue some other things. But Nick, it's been great having you on. I can't tell you how much I feel you've brought to the show and added to what Ed and I have been doing.
Absolutely.
I absolutely love having you on. So when you ever want to come back, just pipe a word and we'll get you back on here. Next episode, we're gonna be talking to Michael Curtis in 2 weeks, dealing with writer's block and problems and how to work through them and stuff like that. So that's coming up soon.
We'll see you then.
Yep. And Reaver Express is up next.
Reaver Express. Have a great night, everybody.
Night.